What's up, everyone? It's Miles here from bootcamp.com, and today in pulmonology, we're going to be going over carbon dioxide. So first, let's start off by talking about carbon dioxide partial pressures in the blood. So recall that carbon dioxide, or CO2, is produced by body cells as a byproduct of cellular respiration. And so that CO2 is going to enter into body capillaries, and then from there directly enter into the venous system, and it's going to enter into the venous system at a partial pressure of 45 millimeters of mercury. And so the partial pressure of CO2 in the venous system, PvCO2, is going to be 45 millimeters of mercury. And so if we just take a look at the alveolar capillary diagram on the right here, we would have blood coming from the venous system, and it would be carrying carbon dioxide at a partial pressure of 45 millimeters of mercury. And so as the blood travels through the pulmonary vessel here, it's going to equilibrate with the alveoli such that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli is going to be the same as the partial pressure of carbon dioxide entering into the arterial system. And so, like I said, after equilibration, both of the alveolar and the arterial partial pressures of CO2 are going to be equal with each other, and they're both going to be 40 millimeters of mercury. And then furthermore, the blood is going to continue on to the arterial system containing a partial pressure of CO2 of 40 millimeters of mercury. All right, so a couple of basic principles about CO2. The solubility of CO2 is very high. And so this high solubility of CO2 has two important consequences. The first is that because CO2 is so soluble, when it's dissolved in a liquid, it doesn't exert a very high partial pressure. And so as a result, even though the pressure is only dropping by 5 millimeters of mercury, we're actually equilibrating a lot of CO2 into the alveoli in order to achieve that pressure drop. The second consequence of the high solubility of CO2 is that it diffuses from the blood across the alveolar capillary membrane very easily. And so even if we had a bit of a diffusion defect between the alveoli and the capillaries, like let's say we had some fibrosis between the alveoli and the capillaries, because the CO2 can diffuse so well, even if there is a diffusion defect, the CO2 is still going to reach full equilibration between the blood and the alveoli. And this is important because the same cannot be said about oxygen, and we'll talk more about this in the oxygen video, but when there's a diffusion defect, oxygen sometimes will not reach full equilibration between the blood and the alveoli. And so because CO2 diffuses so well, we can pretty much always think that the alveolar partial pressure of CO2 is going to equilibrate with or be equal to the arterial partial pressure of CO2, and under normal conditions, they're going to equilibrate with each other at a partial pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury. And so the last basic concept is that, remember in our previous video, we said that if there's a high amount of CO2, that's going to result in carbonic acid production, which is going to produce hydrogen ions. And so whenever there's a high amount of CO2, there's pretty much always a high amount of hydrogen ions. And one more thing is that the enzyme responsible for this conversion is called carbonic anhydrase. And furthermore, hydrogen ions are not the only byproduct of this reaction. We're also producing HCO3-, also known as bicarbonate. All right, so now we're going to be talking about CO2 transport, and we're going to use a diagram to walk through this process. So let's represent a very simplified version of the circulatory system by using this ring. And we'll have the alveoli located at the top, or the lungs located at the top, and we'll have the body tissues located at the bottom. So first we're going to start off with a red blood cell on its way to the body tissues. We can see the red blood cell right here, and inside we see oxyhemoglobin, and just outside the red blood cell we have electrolytes floating around such as chloride. So the next thing we're going to see is the red blood cell at the body tissues. And at the body tissues, we're going to have CO2 production within the body cells, and that CO2 is going to diffuse out of the cells and make its way into the red blood cell. And so remember from our previous video, we talked about the Bohr effect, which was hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen is affected by CO2 at the level of the body tissues. And so all that CO2 in the red blood cell now is going to boot oxygen off of the hemoglobin, and that oxygen is going to get unloaded to the tissues as so, and then CO2 is going to bind to the hemoglobin molecule and produce carbaminohemoglobin. And so we have that in the next picture here. We have the red blood cell, and it's bound to not only CO2, but remember that CO2 is also going to produce hydrogen ions, and those hydrogen ions are also going to get buffered by the hemoglobin. So here we have hemoglobin bound to CO2 and hydrogen ions. And recall that we said from the previous slide that through the actions of carbonic anhydrase, we're not only going to see the production of hydrogen ions from CO2, but we're also going to see the production of bicarbonate. And so now we're going to start to see some intracellular bicarbonate production as well. And also notice how this red blood cell is much larger than the other red blood cells. And the reason for this is because as bicarbonate is produced intracellularly, there's now going to be a concentration gradient for bicarbonate to leave the red blood cell. And so it's going to leave the red blood cell through a transporter called the band 3 transporter. And just like almost any time bicarbonate is exchanged across a transporter, because bicarbonate is a negative ion, the transporter needs to maintain electric neutrality by exchanging bicarbonate with another negative ion. And so in this case, and in most cases, the intracellular bicarbonate here is being exchanged with extracellular chloride. And as extracellular chloride enters into the red blood cell, because it's an osmolyte, it's going to be bringing water in with it, and as a result, we're going to get cellular swelling. And so here at the level of the tissues, chloride shifts into the red blood cell, and that's going to result in cellular swelling. And so this next picture here really depicts the transport of carbon dioxide from the body cells to the lungs. And so we can see here that we have extracellular bicarbonate, and the extracellular bicarbonate actually represents the vast majority of carbon dioxide transport from the body cells to the lungs. So the majority or the major form of carbon dioxide is in the form of extracellular bicarbonate. And secondly, we have a small amount of carbon dioxide that's bound to hemoglobin in the form of carbaminohemoglobin. And lastly, we have this free dissolved carbon dioxide. And this dissolved carbon dioxide, even though it's a very small amount, this is the form of carbon dioxide that exerts a partial pressure. So when we talk about, carbon dioxide exerts a partial pressure of 45 millimeters of mercury in the venous system, we're referring to this form right here, this dissolved carbon dioxide. So let's continue on here. Now the red blood cell is going to reach the lungs. And at the lungs, we have all of that oxygen being intaken into the alveoli, and then that oxygen is going to diffuse directly into the red blood cell. And remember from our previous video, we talked about the Haldane effect, which was hemoglobin's affinity for carbon dioxide is affected by oxygen at the level of the lungs. And so as the concentration of oxygen builds up in the red blood cell, that oxygen is going to kick CO2 off of hemoglobin, and then oxygen is going to bind to hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin, and then we're going to get free CO2 as shown. And then that free CO2 is going to diffuse out of the red blood cell into the alveoli and then get exhaled. And then furthermore, as the CO2 diffuses out of the red blood cell into the alveoli to get exhaled, the concentration of CO2 in the red blood cell is going to drop. And as the CO2 level drops, then any residual bicarbonate that's still present in the red blood cell is going to get converted to carbon dioxide to get subsequently exhaled. And so as a result of CO2 dropping in the red blood cell, the bicarbonate is also going to drop within the red blood cell. And so because the intracellular bicarbonate concentration is decreasing, this is going to create a concentration gradient for the extracellular bicarbonate to now enter into the red blood cell. And so now through a similar transporter, the extracellular bicarbonate is going to be brought into the cell in exchange for chloride shifting out of the cell. And so at the level of the lungs, that extracellular bicarbonate that's entering into the red blood cell is going to be converted into carbon dioxide through the actions of carbonic anhydrase, and then that carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of the red blood cells into the alveoli and then get exhaled. And lastly, because we're bringing bicarbonate into the red blood cell in exchange for chloride shifting out of the red blood cell, like we mentioned earlier, chloride is an osmolyte, so as it shifts out of the red blood cell, it's going to take with it a lot of water. And as a result, the cell is going to shrink, and we're going to end up where we started with a much smaller red blood cell that is on its way to the body tissues. All right, so let's just summarize a few points that we just talked about. So first, when carbon dioxide is transported to the lungs from the tissues. The major form that it's going to be in is bicarbonate, and that's high yield to know. And the other forms that it can be found in is bound to hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin and also dissolved CO2. Next, remember that we said at the level of the tissues where CO2 is being produced and diffusing into the red blood cell, within the red blood cell, through the actions of carbonic anhydrase, we had CO2 conversion into bicarbonate. And so bicarbonate is produced intracellularly inside the red blood cell from CO2 that's coming from the body cells. And now that we have all that bicarbonate produced in the red blood cell, it's going to exchange with chloride, and chloride is going to shift into the red blood cell and cause cellular swelling. And so chloride shifts into the red blood cell in exchange for intracellular bicarbonate, and this is occurring at the level of the tissues. And next, we had the opposite thing occur at the level of the lungs. We're going to have chloride shift out of the red blood cell in exchange for extracellular bicarbonate. And remember that as chloride shifts out of the red blood cell, we're going to get cellular shrinking. And then recall that at the lungs, as bicarbonate is brought into the red blood cell, that bicarbonate is going to be converted to carbon dioxide, and then that carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of the red blood cell into the alveoli, and then it's going to be exhaled. So now we're going to finish up by talking about carbon dioxide and ventilation. And so one way to conceptualize this is the way that the lungs get rid of CO2 is through exhalation. You're not really making any difference to the CO2 level when you inhale, but when you exhale, we're getting rid of CO2. And so if we're breathing in and out a lot, the in doesn't really make any difference, but every time we're breathing out, we're going to be decreasing the amount of CO2 in the blood. We're going to be breathing off a lot of CO2. And so when we are hyperventilating or we're breathing in and out a lot, we're going to be decreasing the partial pressure of CO2 in the arterial system. And if we're not breathing enough, that means that we're not going to be exhaling the proper amount of CO2. And as a result, that CO2 is going to start to build up in the blood. And so if we have hypoventilation, which means we're not breathing enough, that means that the partial pressure of CO2 in the arterial system is going to start to build up. And furthermore, remember that we said if we had a lot of CO2 in the blood, that's going to translate to a lot of hydrogen ions in the blood. And if we have a lot of hydrogen ions, that's going to result in very acidic blood, or in other words, acidosis. And remember that we said an acidic solution is characterized by a low pH. And so if we are hypoventilating and we're not breathing enough, the CO2 levels are going to build up in the blood, and that's going to result in acidosis. And furthermore, if we're hyperventilating and we're breathing too much and we're blowing off all of that CO2, the CO2 levels in the blood are going to drop, and that's going to translate to decreased amounts of hydrogen ions in the blood. And as a result, we're going to have alkalosis, or alkaline blood, which is characterized by a high pH. All right, so that's all we got for our video on carbon dioxide.